To J. Paul Reed.
Good morning. Oh, that works. All right. So as Matt said, my name is Paul Reed. I go online by this. So this slide is really just my Twitter name. So if you want to tweet things at me during the presentation. I just realized, Arup, is this your phone? Do you want it back? Because here's the thing. I turned mine off, but now I'm going to see all the people tweeting about me on your phone. So it's bad. Yeah. All right, so this is, oh yeah, Ship Show, shipshow.com. Those are my co-hosts. They're awesome. They're all great. Ship Show podcast on Twitter. So DevOps equals 42. So obviously 42 is the reference to Hitchhiker's Guide. You know that phrase, how's it go? The answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. And so does DevOps equal 42? I don't know. I mean, I was thinking about this, and I was like, well, in Hitchhiker's Guide, they ask a computer, right? So I'll ask my computer, and you get DevOps is not defined. And then it's like, well, okay, maybe we should define DevOps. So what is DevOps? Actually, wait a minute. So I got to tell you a story. So the idea for this presentation came from Agile Conference, and that's Fletcher and I, and a fair amount of alcohol. And Matt Stratton was there, and we were talking about, what should we talk about at DevOpsDays, like coming up with presentation ideas. And we came up with this Hitchhiker's reference. It was like, that'd be a great presentation. We had the whole story arc for the presentation laid out, and we were ready to go. And then the next morning, I was like, hey, Stratton, do you remember the punchline to the presentation? He's like, nope. And I was like, yeah, but there was something about hitchhikers. Like, yeah. And there was something about DevOps in there. Yeah. But how do we wrap it together? And he's like, I don't know. And it got to like, dude, where's my DevOps presentation? Like, we totally forgot what we were going to say. So let's do a little restart here. I'm not going to talk about DevOps equals 42. I'm actually going to talk about 3 destructive myths of DevOps. So let's restart here. I'm Paul Reed. I'm not an avid Douglas Adams reader. I've been called a DevOps consultant. I don't know how I feel about that. And I drink martinis and other stuff. All right, so let's get into the myths. Myth number 1, DevOps unicorns exist. Who are the unicorns? Shout them out. We all know who they are. Etsy. Netflix. There are others. Come on. Who? Google, yes. Any others? Amazon, Facebook, right. Exactly. Did you guys see the slide deck? I would also include whatever the company in the Phoenix Project was. They're Parts Unlimited. Yes, Parts, thanks. Parts Unlimited. Do you have the book club? The Phoenix Project book club? So we talk and we talk and we talk about these companies, right? We all know who they are. We all look at what they do. And there's an interesting quote, right? If there's anything all horses hate, it's hearing stories about unicorns, right? It's like, and so have you ever had this conversation? You're having an engineering conversation, and you're doing some architecture stuff, and somebody's like, well, Netflix does, and you're just like, don't even start with me. I don't want to hear it. I just don't want to hear it. Because you know what? We're not shipping movies across the internet, right? So then we get into like, well, what are these unicorn things? Like, let's try defining them, right? So Gene Kim, and I don't know if he first said it, but he likes to say unicorns are just trained horses, right? Okay, maybe. I don't know. Like, and then it's like, well, unicorns are real. They're just fat, gray, and we call them rhinos. Like, so there's that going on. Okay. I don't even know what this is. Like, so people have said unicorns are also, somebody was saying they're full stack developers. Maybe that's your full stack developers, Batman. I don't know. I don't know what's going on there. After a while, you're just like, we've reached peak unicorn. I can't talk about this anymore. I can't. What is interesting, Jez Humble said, unicorns are just horses with better PR. And I think there's actually something to this. So we got to stop with the unicorns. Why? Well, it creates a culture of the other. And this is actually a thing in cultural anthropology. where you use language and the way that you describe things to create the other. Actually, if you go and read about this, they call it othering. It's actually a verb. And you can search, Wikipedia has an actually pretty interesting article on the research that's been done. And it comes up in politics and sociology. It's really interesting. I mean, it really is the cool kids, right? We've all been there, junior high, the cool kids table, right? That's what's going on there. We are not unicorns. We're not horses. We're people trying to develop software in complex systems, in complex environments. So have you ever heard this phrase, we're trying to rebuild the plane while it's in flight? People heard that, right? And it means, well, we're deploying Chef, but we still have to do releases, right? So we're working on Chef, but we're kind of rebuilding the plane in flight. As a pilot, I hate this phrase. I hate this phrase because it's not something we do as pilots ever, right? So if you said, it's like saying, well, let's build a rainbow out of the scrap metal I pulled out of my ear. Like, it doesn't even make any sense, right? Now, what's interesting about this is that if you actually look at the operational considerations for when they added a runway to an airport, or when they jack a house up and replace the foundation, like, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of engineering going on. There's a lot of communication going on and coordination going on. We actually could learn something from it if we said, oh, it's like adding a runway to an airport, as opposed to rebuilding the plane in flight. So language matters. We'll come back to that in a moment. The other thing is, most of the unicorns that we talk about, they don't think of themselves as unicorns. The Etsy folks, they'll have a beer with you, and they'll tell you all these horror stories. The Netflix folks, you talk to them, they will tell you what life was like before the cloud. The punchline is it sucked. Nordstrom is really open about their early failures and their struggles, right? So the quote-unquote unicorns don't even think of themselves as unicorns. All right, myth number 2. DevOps is different than every other organizational change process. So we've talked a lot about culture today. We've talked about empathy. I've seen that come up a lot. But I think a lot of those conversations are like, yes, we got to change the culture. Yes, we should have empathy. Let's talk about a tool. Because those things are squishy, and they are hard, and lots of times we're actually not in a position necessarily to quote-unquote change the culture. So it's easier to talk about a tool because there's a concrete thing that we can look at and talk about. What's interesting is, this is with change management, the wiki page for change management. The first line is, change management is an approach to transitioning individuals, teams, and organizations to a desired future state. Kind of sounds like doing the DevOps, right? Changing organizational culture. What's interesting about this, 1960s, right? This has been around for a little while. There's a tiny bit of research on this. Right? Cultural change in 8 easy steps. Sense of urgency, guiding coalition, creative vision, communicate the vision, empowering others, short-term wins, consolidating improvements, and institutionalizing new approaches. Was that too quick for you? There it is in a picture with more notes. And if you want to read more about it, like, I just took that from an article from Harvard Business Review, right? John P. Cotter is a guy that has been doing research on organizational change for something like 50 years. He was a professor at Harvard in the business school, and he wrote 19 books. 12 of them were bestsellers. They're all on organizational change. All of the organizational change stuff that we talk about, I don't see anybody actually referencing what we've been studying in this area for 50 years. In that article, he actually talks about the ways that cultural change fails. I'm not going to go through all of them, but a couple of interesting things I did want to point out. The lacking of vision, right? I mean, people have heard CTO, CIO says, we're doing DevOps now. Go, do the DevOps. Right, what is that? What was the vision? Why am I even doing this? I don't even know. The under-communicating. There was a story here yesterday that actually epitomizes this. Somebody was saying, so we had our SREs and they were in a team and we decided to split the SRE team and embed them with the developers. But nobody told the developers. So the SRE came to the scrum and the developers were like, why are you here? So, well, I'm here to do DevOps. What? right? They didn't communicate that at all, what the plan was. And then not removing obstacles. Many of you probably have run into this. It's like, hey, we're doing DevOps. It's like, okay, great, I need a server. And they're like, go file a ticket. You'll have it in 6 weeks, right? It's kind of not a recipe for success there. So what's interesting is, like, you can get this. I think it's like 20 bucks. And there's a bunch of articles that actually would be useful when we talk about changing culture. Cracking the Code of Change, Radical Change the Quiet Way. Cotter's article, the first one. One interesting insight and one easy takeaway. You change culture by changing behavior, right? So the old thinking used to be, well, if we talk about DevOps, if I talk to you about DevOps enough, if I win you over, then you will change, right? They actually found it's much easier to change behavior. So I was working with a client, and they had no continuous integration, right? They had unit tests, but they didn't have that set up. So we didn't talk about, well, continuous delivery is great, but before you can have continuous delivery, you need to have continuous integration, and your team has to care about the continuous integration server, and they have to look at it, and there's these tools, and you could use Go or Jenkins or whatever. We didn't talk about that. What we said is, we're setting up this thing. It's called Jenkins, and then you have to look at it. And we coached people on, you have to look at it. You can't just check in and go home and be like, I'm done now, right? But that was actually one of the interesting things that we did, is that, like, we actually changed the behavior as opposed to trying to sell them on this continuous integration thing. Now, of course, when they had questions, we would it's not like, hey, we're doing this and you can't ask any questions or you can't talk about it, right? But we led with the behavioral change. And a lot of times, actually, you see this a lot where people are like, oh yeah, this is actually better. Like, I don't get the phone call from my manager at 8 p.m. because I went home and the build was broken and they needed to do a release that night or something like that. So I want to talk about a couple mini myths in this section, right? A DevOps transformation or cultural change can occur without conscious support of your upper management. That's sort of informed by, we're talking about these articles from Harvard Business Review, which are very targeted towards executive leadership and that sort of thing. But I think a lot of you know this, right? If it's a skunkworks project, it's not going to get any traction, right? Because nobody knows what's going on. If it's visible, so it's not skunkworks, but it's unsanctioned, you know how that, we all know how this goes, right? The manager comes and says, why are you doing Chef? What is this Chef thing and why are you doing it? I mean, I know I read in your status report you're doing this configuration management tool thing, but I need to get the release out, so stop doing that, right? And then you kind of have this fits and starts, right? The worst is when it's visible and the management sanctions it and they don't fund it. That's like, and I mean fun not with just like money, but like time, right? They don't plan for it. So a lot of times we talk about grassroots, bottom up, right? You actually have to have a little bit of top down. I have never seen a quote unquote DevOps transformation occur unless the C-levels like understood it more than I read an article in CIO and now we're doing this thing, right? Because we know how that story plays out. It was called Agile, right? Mini myth number 2, small companies can change culture easily and large companies cannot. I worked with a company and we were deploying a release and the deployment failed and we were digging into why, and it turned out that the developers had decided to move to Ubuntu 14 and all of production was Ubuntu 10 and nobody told anybody. Sounds like a big company problem, right? And so we were asking, you know, they were we're doing DevOps, we're da-da-da, right? And so the developer actually said, well, I thought DevOps was when I need it changed, I just tell the ops team to change it and they drop whatever they're doing because that's DevOps, right? So what's interesting about that story, that was a 20-person startup. That was not some big, huge company. So small companies have problems with this as well. Now, take that in contrast to something like the story of Gary Groover and HP printer firmware. He independently invented continuous delivery. He didn't talk to Jez Humble. He independently invented it with printer firmware at HP, right? So big companies can do this. It really is how they manage that transformation process. And finally, and a really important myth, that cultural change is pleasant. You may have seen this. This was another article in Harvard Business Review, how Netflix reinvented HR. It's a fascinating read. You should go read it. But what's interesting about it, I was having a conversation with a friend, and I was like, there are 2 stories of people getting laid off or fired in this article. And they talk about how they did that and how they did it in a way that worked for the person and the company. So the quote, it's interesting, right? We had to be willing to let go of people whose skills no longer fit, no matter how valuable their contributions had once been. Out of fairness to such people, and frankly, to help us overcome our discomfort with discharging them, we learned to offer rich severance packages. So what's interesting here is Netflix in particular is very blatant about this, right? They expect you to put the time and effort in, and if you're not doing that, they don't spend a lot of time with like performance improvement plans and things like that. There's actually a quote in their culture deck that says, adequate performance gets a generous severance package. So this may sound cruel, and in fact I had a couple friends and we were talking about this, and like, God, those Netflix guys are just a bunch of assholes, right? But we've talked a lot about empathy, and what's interesting about this is they're treating people like adults. They tell them what they need them to do, and if they don't want to do what the business wants to do, it's not a big, I've actually talked with people that have left Netflix, it's not a big, like, you suck or you failed. It's, you just didn't want to do what Netflix wanted to do. You know, I can think of nothing less empathetic than a performance improvement plan. If you're a manager and have had to do one of those with an employee, right? Because we all know it's a game. It's a 3-month game. That person's going to be gone. Netflix doesn't do that. They do generous severance packages. That's how they account for that. This is the, you may have heard this before, freedom and responsibility. There's a link to the deck. It's like 100 slides, but they're not a lot of writing on the slides. It's an interesting read. You shouldn't pick it up necessarily wholesale, but it's still an interesting read. So myth number 3, excellence doesn't matter. What do I mean by excellence? I don't mean, hey, bodacious dude. You may have heard, if you live here, that the air traffic control facility had a little problem. You may have heard, if you flew in here, that the air traffic control facility had a little problem. This is a map from the day after, where it's like, okay, everybody go around, right? This is a controller at Chicago Center. He said even with Chicago Center at ATC 0, which is what they call that, and all the problems going on, Chicago still had the most operations in the country yesterday. They pushed more airplanes than any airport in this country without radar. That is excellence. That's what I mean. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I kind of started with, like, what is DevOps? Heady question. Lucis on Twitter, John Vincent, still gives the best definition of DevOps. I love saying it. I love talking about it. DevOps is giving a shit about your job, not enough to not pass the buck. And giving a shit about your job enough to want to learn all of the parts and not just your little world, right? This whole bit, you know, a lot of times we talk about empathy. Part of empathy is actually caring what you send down the line, the product that you're sending down the line. I also like the way he describes it because it's kind of raw, right? I mean, we all know when someone does, I mean, we say it, right? That guy doesn't give a shit. Like, we know what that means, right? A mini myth about this, the silos that we all talk about, right? Because we were talking about having empathy and sort of the systems thinking concept, caring about what goes, the inputs and outputs are to the work that you do. I think a lot of times we talk about the silos and we think, oh, they're grain silos. They're cute, there's a little bed and breakfast, right? Kevin Baer, who's one of the authors of the Phoenix Project, famously said, silos are a horrible analogy because grain goes in, grain comes out, like they're a system that things go in and out of. If they don't, they explode, right? It's a horrible analogy. These are the actual silos that we're talking about. This is a nuclear missile silo, right? Information doesn't really go in or out. They're concrete bunkers. There's large doors, right? And in really bad cultures, all of those nukes are armed and pointed at the other missile silos, right? So this is John Allspaw from Etsy. He had a quote, "Oh, that's just semantics dismissively said by everyone who thinks word, language, and meaning don't matter, but they do." This is another example of excellence. It's the idea that the work that we do and how we do that work is just as important as the end product, right? How many times have you been, had a coworker, something's like, "Oh, something's wrong on that machine, I will go fix it," right? And it's opaque, right? They go do some magic, right? And then later, like, well, what happened there? Like, how did you get the thing, right? And maybe it's broken the next day, and it's not their fault, right? It's just they, for whatever reason, weren't transparent about what they were doing. This whole idea that, these organizations that are high functioning, they care about the way that they do their work. That's important. They talk a lot about it, right? They don't allow people to say, well, I don't want to have this conversation because we all think we understand what each other are saying. They work through that. That's very interesting. It's very interesting to be a part of a culture like that that actually doesn't mind sometimes those painful meetings. This is a quote from How to Change Culture Lessons from NUMMI. NUMMI was a co-venture between Toyota and GM. It was a manufacturing plant in Fremont, actually, which is close to where I live, Fremont, California. And so John Shook writes a lot about this. He said the and-done system epitomizes Toyota's belief in and commitment to developing the means to enable employees to work in a way that builds in quality. So the and-on system, what is that? It's those little cords along the production line, the arrows, you can see them pointing, right? And they basically empower any employee to stop the line. And in fact, from a management perspective, they say employees aren't doing their job if they see a problem and don't pull that cord. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the line will stop. When that happens, a manager comes over, they work through the problem, and if they can't get it solved in the time that they have at that station, then they will stop the line. So it's not like an automatic thing. But what's interesting about this, how many people have been in go, no-go meetings, and everybody goes around and they say, yeah, we're go, yeah, we're go, yeah, and you lean over and you're like, I'm not really a go. Can I say no-go? And they're like, no. Because then if you say no-go, well, I will just horse trade with you about what you need to turn that into a go, right? Call those go-go meetings, right? And what's interesting about that, right, is like the picture in our heads is like NASA, right? Apollo mission, ecom, weather, whatever, Capcom, surgeons, right? They all go, right? That's this big, the music's thundering up before launch, all that kind of stuff, right? But even NASA had problems with that. Go, no-go meetings turning into go-go meetings. It's called STS-51 Lima, which was the Challenger explosion. So when you don't empower people to actually stop the line to solve problems, it's problematic. This is that article I was talking about earlier. The link, you can read it. What's interesting, this is in Sloan Business School, right? So we're talking about like people doing research on this. Harvard Business Review actually has an article on the NASA management decision-making, like the problem that happened with Challenger there. It's an interesting read. This is kind of a long quote. I'm going to read it, but because I thought it was really important. What changed the culture at NUMMI wasn't an abstract notion of employee involvement or a learning organization or even this fuzzy culture at all. What changed the culture was giving employees the means by which they could successfully do their jobs. It was communicating clearly to employees what their jobs were and providing the training and tools to enable them to perform those jobs successfully. In other words, we care about excellence as an organization, as a company, as a set of leaders, and we expect our employees to care about excellence. And it's not lip service. It's not a mission statement on a wall where we all look at it in the go-go meeting where we ship the thing that's about to screw all our customers because it wasn't tested, because we didn't give QA the tools they needed and the time they needed to do that. Now, if you read a lot about this, you'll see Toyota Kata is referenced a lot, this idea of continuous improvement. And it's interesting, like you read this book, it's by Mike Rother. He was a consultant, and it was funny because people, saw Toyota doing all these great things, and so they were talking because Mike Ruther studied them, right? And they would say, what is Toyota doing? And Mike would tell them, and then Toyota would change what they were doing, and he'd run back to Japan, and he'd tell them, and what are they doing now? And he'd give them the new advice, right? I guess I can't walk right in here. And what he basically found out is he was telling companies and organizations what Toyota was doing. This book is about actually what they were doing is learning how to learn and learning how to continuously improve. And so that's actually what this book is on. So quick question, and a lot of people are probably like, well, maybe I don't work in an environment like that, and I don't know how I'm going to get people to care. Who's hiring? Raise your hand. Okay. Now, don't keep them up. Now, put your hand down if the organization that you're working for currently does not give a shit about its products or customers. Okay. So, I see hands half going down. Maybe they care about the customers but not the product so much. I don't know what that means. Okay. Everyone who's not in an environment like this, talk to these people. They will give you their business cards. They will want you to come work with them. Excellent people and people who care about excellence want to work with people who care about excellence, who give a shit about their job. All right, so DevOps 42, back to the original question. I did not read this book. I didn't read Hitchhikers. I'm a bad nerd, I know. So I do what everybody does, Wikipedia, right? So this is a summary from the page on it. And it was interesting, right? Because 42 is the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. And it was calculated by deep thought, right? This computer that IBM probably built. And it said, deep thought points out that the answer seems meaningless because the beings who instructed it never actually knew what the question was. So Matt wanted all of us speakers to have kind of a big takeaway, right? Something actionable. And this is my ask. I want you to discover your own DevOps. I want you to figure out what those questions are for your organization. And then I want you, as a member of a community of practitioners doing this DevOps thing that we're all figuring out. Kevin Bear likes to say DevOps is emergent, right? We're figuring it out together. Use those techniques to come up with your own answers. Not what Netflix did, not what Nordstrom did, not what Google did. And I want you to keep in mind that when we bandy about culture and empathy and these kind of squishy topics, there's science we can go to. There's cultural anthropology, there's sociology, there's business management science. And I want you to demand excellence in yourselves, in others that you work with, and in your companies. And I want you to do it while you're being excellent to each other. Thanks. Now, before we do questions, I'd like to point out, so this is an O'Reilly little thing, DevOps in Practice. It's free, you can download it. I actually have 3 copies, and I'm happy to give them away. Tweet at me, and if more than 3 people want one, we'll do a raffle or something. This is 2 case studies. It's Nordstrom and Texas.gov, and it's how their DevOps transformation went and the things that they learned. So check that out if that's a topic that interests you.
Thanks, Paul. Questions for Paul?
So I was looking at the John Shook quote about why Toyota really succeeded and that it wasn't learning, whatever, it wasn't culture, it was properly trained employees and tools and stuff. But it seems like it really was culture, because I've read a couple studies on that as well. And, I mean, there's other
So you're asking about the dichotomy?
Yeah.
So I think, honestly, what I would say is that quote may have, the way he structured it, may have been for effect. That was in that Sloan article, so you kind of want punchy quotes that people like me will put on slides. So I think you're right? But I think what he was pointing out, that we all talk about culture, but then we talk about it like, Google has a culture, right? And I think his point was, well, actually, the NUMMI culture was pretty bad. They had a lot of absenteeism, and people there's a funny story. People used to put Coke cans in the doors so the door would rattle, stuff like that, right? Just because they were pissed off, right? And it took them going to Japan, see how Toyota runs things, and then, but that wasn't enough, right? When they brought back, it was empowering them to do the thing, right? Do their jobs and do it well. So that's where I think the distinction he's making between like corporate culture that we think about and like the actual on the ground culture of the people in their day-to-day lives doing their job.
Okay. Yeah, because I just thought of all that as cultural change.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And, that's fine to put them together. I think sometimes it's useful to actually separate them out, right? Because that's that whole, we're having the meeting, whatever the meeting is, and there's the mission statement. And is the meeting at all related to that mission statement? Right.
Getting all my Fitbit steps in.
Wondering about your advice for a go-go meeting. I mean, I before have said, well, we should go because it's going to fail, and then we'll learn why. But
So I've been in those meetings as a consultant and as a employee. And if you're there as a consultant, it's interesting, right? Because you can kind of say things that like other people can't say, right? Just because that's what you're actually paid to do. So it's kind of weird. What I have done in both situations is I just actually, because I'm kind of that guy, I will just ask in the meeting, if I say no go, will this train stop? And usually the leader or the project manager or whatever, either, like if they're honest, they're like, no, we're doing this, so your objection is noted, now get on the train. I just then make sure that a bunch of people have seen that, right? And then if it fails, right, this is not I told you so. I mean, it is sort of, but the bigger thing is that in the next meeting, because a lot of times if I'm no-go, somebody else is probably also no-go. Probably the person that's upstream or directly downstream from the thing I was supposed to do, right, is also probably no-go. So in that way, it can sort of empower people to actually talk the person who is trying to convince everyone to go down from that. And actually make, because a lot of times, like, no one wants to be that no-go guy, right? So that's how I have handled it, with varying degrees of success. Because I've had it where I ask that, like, can I actually say no-go? And they say, oh yeah, and then the train stops, right? And then the other time it's been like we have that meeting, we do the deployment, it blows up, and you do that 4 or 5 times, people start asking the project manager, because they're supposed to be managing the project, why is this keep happening, right? Change is a slow process. That's one thing I actually didn't say. The articles they talk about, like, when we talk about cultural change, we're talking about 2 to 5 years, right? So it's a slow process.
More questions?
Everybody's like, oh, it's lunch. Let's go.
I know, right? So
Yeah, and
I think there's probably some good fodder for open spaces that
Yes.
came out of this too. So thanks again, Paul. Thank you very much.
thank you.